Yes, go ahead. Okay, now we're going to focus on Philippine-China relations, and of course the highlight this past week of August 7 to August 13 is the ASEAN 50 Summit. ASEAN is now 50 years old. So what is the assessment of the world? If you look at the Western media, Western mainstream media, well, you'll hear all sorts of carping. But on the other side of the world, and the other side of the fence, we hear, for example, from Dmitry Kosyrov, whose image was flashed earlier and we'll flash it again, who writes in Sputnik, the Russian website that has been a sensational hit all over the world because it has been presenting the other side of the story very accurately. And his article, or this report on his view, ASEAN Summit, how China diplomatically outflanked the U.S. in Manila. China continues to win diplomatic victories, according to Kosyrov, versus the United States in Southeast Asia. The RIA Novosti political observer Dmitry Kosyrov writes, according to the analyst, Washington has nothing to offer to ASEAN nations except military support in a potential conflict with China. It appears that contrary to the U.S. expectation, Beijing has outperformed Washington during the recent Association of Southeast Asian Nations conference in Manila, the Philippines. The Russian political observer Dmitry Kosyrov writes for the RIA Novosti. According to Kosyrov, China continues to score political victories in the region. The observer drew attention to the fact that earlier the American diplomats had tried to convince Asian leaders to oust the North Korean minister from the list of participants of the conference. However, Washington only received a polite refusal. Then the, quote, decisive condemnation of Pyongyang, unquote, wasn't included in the joint communique, regardless of Washington's displeasure, because one country, Cambodia, China's close ally, blocked the issue. The journalist remarked, adding that a separate statement on the Korean crisis was adopted later, condemning North Korea, quote, but the statement was a document of a lower level, unquote. And quote again, in Manila, China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi was the hero of the day, while his country was even called a, quote, honorary member of ASEAN, unquote. First, Wang Yi condemned Pyongyang and recalled that China had earlier voted in the United Nations for new sanctions against the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Second, he called upon the North Koreans to be smart and bring their missile tests to a halt, the journalist wrote. Third, Wang Yi and his Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, reminded the meeting of a joint initiative of Beijing and Moscow on a double freeze. That means that DPRK stops any missile launches and nuclear tests, while the U.S. and South Korea suspend large-scale military exercises in the region. We expect, to quote, that through the reasonable approach of all actors, including the United States, South Korea, and Japan, we could find a decision that would satisfy all parties, unquote, according to Sergei Lavrov. While the double freeze concept appears to be the solution for the long-standing problem, Washington is reluctant to accept it. Citing Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary Susan Thornton, the journalist noted that the double freeze proposal is, according to Thornton, morally unacceptable for Washington since it places the DPRK and the U.S. on equal footing. Maybe you can comment on that later on. What is acceptable in the eyes of Washington is to isolate Pyongyang, according to Kosyrov. One should remember that diplomacy issues should be resolved only on the basis of equal footing, the journalist stressed. As a result, tension continues to simmer in Asia, but the U.S. is unlikely to win some sort of joyful support from ASEAN. But that is not all. One of the region's most burning issues has long been the territorial dispute in the South China Sea. However, it seems that the conflict has been downplayed. Under its current president, Rodrigo Duterte, the Philippines has changed its position sharply. According to Kosyrov, seeing what's happening in Singapore has also softened its stand because China has been putting pressure on Singapore. while other countries of the region have also become imbued with an understanding of the Chinese position. Only Vietnam remained isolated. It was completely a different situation a year or two ago. There is yet another victory for the Chinese diplomacy. ASEAN nations and Beijing adopted the framework for further talks on the Code of Conduct in the South China Sea. The Code is not about how to resolve territorial disputes involving at least 4 ASEAN countries and China, let alone Taiwan, Kosirev stressed. Such disputes are hardly ever resolved. The Code is about how to behave today while the disputes are not over, and how to bring the scandal to an end and resume cooperation. I think we'll cut it off from there. But the essential reasons of Kosirev in saying that that China has outflanked diplomatically the U.S. has been explained there. What are your reactions?
Let me point out the difference in the U.S. approach, foreign policy approach towards ASEAN and that of China. You know, the approach of China is to synchronize its own policy to the policy of ASEAN, because definitely the policy of China is different from that of ASEAN, but China is always conscious and always eager to adjust and synchronize its policy with ASEAN. So in that way, that synchronization will blend. That what will promote Chinese interest will also promote the ASEAN interest. That is the difference. In the U.S. approach, it's different. It is the United States that is promoting its policy using ASEAN to adopt its policy, not synchronize. I mean, the United States would want the ASEAN to do that. The United States would want ASEAN to do this without the ASEAN agreeing whether it is acceptable to that policy. A good case is with China. A good case in its policy in the ASEAN or in the South China Sea. Now, China, for instance, the approach of China in implementing the South China Sea, the so-called freedom of navigation there, is to synchronize it with the interest of the ASEAN countries. No problem. Mainly that's why it is easily endorsed by most of these countries. The same thing is the so-called double freeze. The Chinese government perhaps emphasized the idea of double freeze because it takes two to tango.
That's right.
The United States must also do its part to de-escalate, to diffuse the tension in the north of Asia. So that is the basic difference between the United States policy and the Chinese policy. The United States has been used to the idea of dictating and using these states, ASEAN, as what we call I don't want to use the word puppet, but something that it can dictate.
Yeah.
You do this for us.
I think that's why ASEAN at 50 has become finally an independent body, and the only crease in this past week has been Vietnam's position in trying to insist on strong language, which it says is against China, but it is not.
But eventually, Vietnam will be isolated because the sentiment of Vietnam is not really the sentiment of ASEAN.
Precisely.
Let's be honest about it.
It's like the sentiment of the Philippines under Noynoy Aquino on these issues was not the sentiment of ASEAN.
It's not the sentiment. And nobody cares.
Yeah. And the other claimants, Malaysia and Brunei, are practically...
to restate what I said, the sentiment of China in Southeast Asia is China is trying to adjust its sentiment in Southeast Asia to that of the ASEAN, so that it will be integrated as a sentiment of ASEAN. It will be acceptable to the ASEAN. You cannot just impose and tell them to do this.
But let's examine the position of Vietnam in trying to appear, and I explained it in my postings on the internet, that trying to project an underdog image to cover and push its agenda of pressuring China. But I wanted to cite this article from 2015, June 18, and which is still very relevant. And the title is, "Who is the biggest aggressor in the South China Sea?" Let's review the facts. And maybe we can flash that article. Who is the biggest aggressor in the South China Sea? If you look at the map there, it's quite small, but you can anyway go to the Diplomat and review it. You will see the whole South China Sea dotted with Vietnamese flags. Because the Vietnamese have 45 to 48 outposts and islands and features that it has established facilities on. It says here in this report, in the past 20 years, Vietnam has doubled its holdings in the South China Sea. In 1996, Vietnam occupied 24 features in the Spratly Islands. At that time, according to the same source, China occupied 9. By 2015, according to the United States government, Vietnam occupied 48 and China occupied 8. In fact, it was reduced by 1. On May 13, U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense David Scheer said this to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Quote, Vietnam has 48 outposts, the Philippines 8, China 8, Malaysia 5, Taiwan 1. In the past 20 years, according to the United States, China has not physically occupied additional features. By contrast, Vietnam has doubled its holdings, and much of that activity has occurred recently. And this is from the American Deputy Secretary. Anyway, the Vietnamese occupations appear to have increased from 30 to 48 in the last 6 years, up to 2015. Scheer also pointed out that as part of his speech, China did not have an airfield as other claimants did. All of these, he said, same claimants have also engaged in construction activity of different scope and degree. This was at that time that he was reporting to the U.S. Senate. The types of outpost upgrades vary across claimants, but broadly are comprised of land reclamation, building construction and extension, and defense emplacement. Between 2009 and 2014, Vietnam was the most active claimant in terms of both outpost upgrades and land reclamation, claiming approximately 60 hectares. All territorial claimants, with the exception of China and Brunei, have also already built airstrips of varying. This was May of 2015. But of course, the report also clarifies that it appears China has now, this is May again, June of 2015, has now built an airfield, and that this was already visible in April 2015 and so on. So anyway, the report goes on. But the point is, Vietnam is exercising double standard and a great degree of hypocrisy, which is effective because it is supported by Western mainstream media, that China is the most aggressive in reclamation. And in fact, we also have reports of Vietnam setting up rocket launchers and so on in the past year or two. So I just want to make it clear to the public and to the Filipino people and to the rest of the world that the facts will show that Vietnam has been the most aggressive. And this is the American Deputy Undersecretary is that who said this, no?
Yeah.
And the fact is, while it is presenting a very brave front, and we have no doubt, the Vietnamese are very courageous people, and however, in the recent case of the oil drilling with the Spanish company Repsol, when China protested, in the South China Sea, Vietnam halted its drilling after the Western press calls it China threat, but it's just a notice from China.
That's really,
maybe did we flash that on screen? South China Sea, Vietnam halts drilling after China threat. In other words, contrary to the image it's trying to project and what the China critics here in the Philippines and in the West have been saying, that China is so Vietnam is so tough that it's opposing China. No, it listens to China also.
Actually,
yeah, go ahead.
The main reason why Vietnam has not gained any supporters in the ASEAN, because facts reveal otherwise. First, as you said, most of the islands in this Spratly and in the Parasols are occupied by Vietnam. That's one thing. Second, in the Treaty of San Francisco, it indicated that both Paracel and Spratly should be returned to China. It did not mention Vietnam. So, if you are a political analyst, the first thing that you will ask is, why is Vietnam there in Spratly? The only perhaps we can give it to Vietnam, the only virtue that it has, why it should occupy a portion of Paracels Island because of geographical proximity. But definitely, there's no business
In Spratlys.
encroaching in the Spratlys.
That's right,
That's the second.
And let me add, it is Vietnam that stole Phuket Island.
Yes.
Already occupied by the Philippines.
Yes.
In 1975, this happened.
Yes.
Yet all these so-called Filipino patriots, like the Carpios and the Roy Logoleses, are not mentioning that.
Did not mention that. Another thing that is important also is that the Chinese is quite patient with Vietnam. For instance, while it allowed to exploit the natural resources in the area, when it should not be there. In fact, China has all the right to prohibit Vietnam to drive out the Vietnamese forces in the Spratly or even in the Paracel Islands, but it has not done any action to drive them out. But it seems that Vietnam is going too far. This time, it's not only exploiting this natural resource, but inviting foreign partners to help it develop oil. Now,
I think that is what China does not accept. Yeah.
It is just like, say, for instance, under the Treaty of Paris in 1898, it demarcated our national boundary, and that excluded definitely the Spratly Islands. And yet we have occupied some of the islands in the Spratlys, and China has not done anything to drive us out. Perhaps China can tolerate that. Do you think China will tolerate that if we will invite Shell, Caltex, and other international oil companies to exploit the minerals in that area?
And that is why Carpio is trying to stop.
That's a big question.
State-to-state relations.
China will not allow that. That's a big problem. That's what I give this an example because that is what Vietnam now is doing, inviting Repsol.
Yeah. Well, okay, we have to move on and since we're running out of time, Philippine Foreign Secretary says ASEAN at 50 is the best time for change to achieve ASEAN dream, and Foreign Secretary Cayetano tells the foreigners, don't tell us what to do. Philippines tells countries on sea dispute. That is in particular Australia, the US, and Japan. Okay, so let me just briefly read through it, but I'll cut it a bit short because we're running out of time. Philippine Foreign Affairs Secretary Alan Peter Cayetano said, this is the best time for ASEAN members to take the role of being partners for change as the regional bloc celebrates its 50th year. Cayetano last August 5 welcomed his counterparts from different member states of the ASEAN as they gathered in Manila for the 50th ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting. Cayetano described the event as a golden opportunity for the 10 member states of ASEAN to take the role of being partners for change. And I'll move faster. What is that change? I think you've just mentioned it. ASEAN is no longer a tool of the Western powers.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, and finally, ASEAN, the chair of ASEAN, which is the Philippines, represented by Foreign Secretary Cayetano, since we have a few minutes to the end of our discussion, tells the United States, Japan, and Australia, which released a joint statement that urged both Manila and Beijing to heed the 2016 international ruling on the South China Sea. What are these three countries talking about? Neither the United States, nor Japan, nor Australia is involved in this issue. Why are they insisting on this?
Because, for instance, let us give it to them. If the Philippines will insist to enforce the arbitration court's decision, it will be speaking not as ASEAN, but as the Republic of the Philippines. You cannot bring in the ASEAN to help you enforce that decision. That's foolish. Second, the United States, Japan, and Australia are not members of the ASEAN. They are just guests.
That's right, yeah.
They were just invited guests of the ASEAN. That's the only thing. And rather, because if the United States will insist, we might as well also insist. Why don't you enforce that against Russia or Crimea?
Well,
that's insulting.
So finally, after the ASEAN Summit ASEAN 50 Summit, we have come to the conclusion, assessing it with Rod Kapunan, that ASEAN is now free and independent of the Western powers. That is our discussion for August 7 to August 13 on Philippines-China Focus.